In this lecture, we're going to move from the philosophical and economic critiques of Western civilization to the political challenge mounted by two major movements, communism and fascism, which I've mentioned before, but now I want to go into more detail. Both of these movements, of course, flourished as a direct result of the First World War and the Depression. What I would argue is that communism and fascism articulate some of the same critiques of liberalism and the Enlightenment project that we saw earlier in the artistic and philosophical movements, but they frame it in a political language. So what I want to do in the next two lectures is to analyze communist and fascist ideologies as a major theoretical challenge, a political theoretical challenge to liberalism, and then later we'll talk more specifically about how these ideologies took shape in the particular regimes of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. While communism and fascism were very distinct ideologies in terms of the goals that they were directed towards, what united them was the claim to have a solution to liberalism's failure to make the transition to mass politics. That is, Western civilization had created, as we talked about, this thing called mass society, but didn't really know how to organize it or incorporate it into a political system which had been essentially elitist in the 19th century. Even with the implementation, of universal suffrage, there hadn't been a real successful attempt to build mass parties, to figure out how to get people incorporated. So in this period, when governments were struggling with the question of how to create a political system that could organize the masses without dissolving into chaos, or into socialism, because of course the socialists had been the only parties before the war to really build mass parties, fascism and communism claimed to have such a system of organizing the masses in a coherent way into politics. Now, obviously, they each had a different version of a political system that would be appropriate to a mass society. But what they had in common was their claim that the politics of individualism was dead. So in this sense, they joined the chorus of voices that are arguing that mass society has made the individual obsolete. They're agreeing with this general sentiment. Instead, both fascism and communism argue that society should be organized into groups. Groups, communities, whether the class, in the sense of the communist theory, or the nation for the fascists. And that politics then should be about protecting these groups rather than about protecting individuals, which of course is what liberalism was about. In this way, the masses could be organized and mobilized within this broader framework of working for the greater good, either of the nation or of the class. Now, this premise, of course, led to a radically different understanding of politics and society, which of course we'll talk about. Both theories also had a similar idea about how to mobilize these groups as well. What was required in both cases was a leadership cadre who was capable of understanding the greater goal. That is, a leadership cadre who understood what the future of the class was or what the future of the nation was, and who could then draw the masses into that project. So Mussolini talked, for example, about a dynamic minority who would be leading the masses into that project. And Lenin, of course, thought the revolution would be led by what he called the vanguard party. In both cases, a minority group who understood the larger project and what everybody needed to be brought into. What both movements sought to instill in the masses that they were trying to recruit was a deeper sense of belonging than was offered by liberalism. Thus, communism, of course, offered workers a sense of identity through designating the working class as the agent of the future socialist revolution. Workers had a tremendous sense of importance and responsibility through this project. And fascism, of course, offered individuals a sense of identity as part of building a great nation. So both movements offered ways to organize the alienated and atomized masses of mass society and integrate them into political life. And in this way, to offer a solution to the challenge of mass society. In contrast, liberal governments hadn't been able to create a sense of belonging that united people behind them. Of course, liberalism was always talking about the pursuit of individual interests, the pursuit of that rational self-interest that each individual should, in their own private life, be pursuing. But liberalism didn't have a language of belonging, a language of what we're all doing together. And this message of the pursuit of rational self-interest played very well with elites, but it didn't play as well with the masses, not all of whom had an interesting life project, we could put it that way. They had the sense of wanting to belong to something larger. And this is especially, I think, important in an age of secularization, where fewer people have religion to appeal to as a kind of project that's beyond their individual mediocre or everyday lives. So it's this gap between the individual and the community that made liberalism, I think, so vulnerable to these challenges, especially at that moment when people's sense of bearings has been turned upside down by a world that's in upheaval. In making the transition from the politics of rational individuals, as liberalism envisioned it, to the politics of mass groups, both movements embodied what I would call a different spirit. And this spirit included a rejection of the past, much like the philosophical post-war movements that we talked about earlier, and the consequent rejection of a framework of rationalism that had justified liberalism. If reason was the language of communication for the individual, then emotion was the language of communication for the masses. To bring the masses into a political project required reaching their hearts, not their minds. Thus, instead of reason as the organizer of politics, both communism and fascism argued for the primacy of what Nietzsche would call the will. That is, human agency could make history through heroic effort. So it's that kind of spirit of the age. Instead of the comfortable, staid progress of reason, both communism and fascism pushed for high drama, the excitement of jumping into the void, that kind of vitalism that's so prevalent in the post-war spirit, and that we talked about earlier in the futurist movement and the Dadaist movement. So despite then the major differences in terms of communist and fascist goals, in many ways they shared in a common post-war spirit, especially in their rejection of individualism and in their emphasis on action over reason. It's not hard to imagine how, even on this kind of intangible level of fitting in with a larger spirit of the age, that this adds to the attraction of these movements, which seem to look to the future while liberalism appeared to look to the past. While fascism's relationship to this new spirit is fairly straightforward, the communist movement of the post-war period was actually an adaptation of an earlier 19th century movement, that is Marxism. Marx, of course, had already come up with what he thought was the solution to the challenge of mass politics in the 19th century. But as of World War I, Marxism hadn't come to power anywhere. What happens in the early 20th century is that Marxism, in a sense, gets a makeover, incorporating new elements that make it particularly powerful and attractive at this historical moment. This makeover gives the movement new life, a new incarnation that comes to be called communism. So while socialism and communism have the same goals, we distinguish between those two labels to make that distinction between the 19th century movement and the 20th century. And of course, the person most identified with Marxism's facelift was Lenin, who thus becomes the key figure in 20th century communism. Now, in order to understand what he added to Marxism, we need to begin with a review of Marx's ideas in order to look at the contrast. Although it's a bit of an exaggeration, I think we can say that the difference between Marx and Lenin seems to capture the 19th and 20th century spirits. It may sound odd to say that Marx, that great anti-liberal rebel, epitomized the 19th century world. Wasn't Marx criticizing everything that liberals believed in? He thought capitalism was evil. He thought that it created an oppressed working class, forced to work their fingers to the bone for the benefit of capitalists who did nothing but invest money. So whereas liberals thought that capitalism had made Europe rich, Marx argued that capitalism had made the bourgeoisie rich and the rest of the people poor. Furthermore, he argued that liberalism was nothing more than the justification for capitalism, a prop designed by and for the rich who benefited. So, in Marx's terms, individualism was really a code word for allowing the privileged few to protect their property. To remedy this, he, of course, envisioned a world led by the working class, not the rich, and guided by a different motto, quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, unquote. This was then the final goal of the socialist movement, to work towards this end. So given these attacks on liberalism and capitalism, in what way was Marx still a product of the 19th century? What Marx believed as strongly as the liberals, and I mentioned this earlier, was the inevitable progress through reason. History was moving inexorably towards a better and better world through man's increasingly capable reason. So like Adam Smith or Darwin or most of the great post-Enlightenment thinkers up until Nietzsche, Marx agreed and believed that there were powerful structural forces at work pushing human society towards a more evolved state, with of course the implication that there was some sort of state of perfection at the end of the line. So Marx saw himself as a scientist reading the laws of history. The difference with liberal thinkers, of course, came in the content of that progress. What did a more evolved state look like? And how did society get there? For liberals, human evolution was measured by the expansion of capitalism, the unleashing of free economic forces, the expansion of individual freedoms. That was how progress was measured within liberal theory. According to this standard, of course, many European countries had evolved almost to perfection by the late 19th century, and that's why there was such a sense of self-satisfaction and complacency in middle-class society. Now, Marx agreed that the age of capitalism and liberalism indeed represented progress over what had come before, that is, the feudalist age. But the difference, of course, was he argued that capitalism was only a stage on the way to an even more evolved state, that is, socialism. So he agreed that human history was progressing, but that liberals were, in a sense, proclaiming the end of history too soon. Furthermore, and I think this is what really marks him as a 19th century thinker, he insisted that liberals could do nothing to stop this next transition. Capitalism and liberalism would be overthrown just as inevitably as feudalism had been overthrown before it. And the bourgeoisie would be displaced from dominance just as they had once displaced the aristocracy before them. The new class of the future was the working class or the proletariat, and they would rule a society based on economic equality, not competition. So history then was about the struggle of classes, not individuals. So what were these forces that pushed history forward, that were going to push the transition from capitalism to socialism? For Marx, these forces were primarily economic. It was economics that was the motor of history, that initiated changes that would then reverberate in politics, in society, in culture, and so on. Specifically, it was what he called the mode of production that initiated change. What is the mode of production? Simply, the mode of production is the way economic activity in a society is organized. Who owns what? How things are made, who works for whom, and so on. That constitutes the mode of production. So in capitalism, the mode of production involves a small number of entrepreneurs who invest capital and a large number of men without capital, literally, who were forced to sell their labor for wages. This was the proletariat. So that was the mode of production under capitalism. So how did the mode of production then spark historical change? How exactly does that work? How does the mode of production inevitably cause society to move from one phase to the next, or from a liberal system to a socialist one? Basically, what Marx argued was it occurred through the system's own internal contradictions. When capitalism replaced feudalism, it created a new set of economic elites who then struggled to attain political power as well, political power to match their economic power. And of course, that new class was the bourgeoisie, and they struggled to take power from the aristocracy, who were the old elites. And again, in Marxist ideology, the moment of transfer of power was the French Revolution. The French Revolution was about the bourgeoisie taking political power from the aristocracy after they had already taken economic power. Since Marx believed that liberalism was simply an ideological cover for capitalist interests, the economic and political interests in the 19th century were the same. It was the same class that controlled politics and the economic power in society. However, at the same time, of course, the new capitalist economy, he argued, would create a new class of oppressed people. And this was, of course, the proletariat, the industrial proletariat. And this was the internal contradiction. Capitalism created and nurtured its own enemy, the proletariat. Marx theorized that the tension between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat would cause the latter, that is, the proletariat, the working class, to become aware of their oppression and then to organize themselves into trade unions and socialist parties, which would in turn lead to the overthrow of the bourgeois rule and replace it with working class rule. And this, of course, is the story that Marx tells in his great pamphlet, The Communist Manifesto, which he wrote in 1848. This story of the inevitable tension between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, which would lead to future revolution. So in other words, if you follow that logic, the more capitalist society evolved, the larger and more organized its internal enemy will be. Right? The proletariat at the beginning of the transition to capitalism is weak and small, but the more capitalism evolves, the stronger the proletariat becomes, the more organized they become, the more revolutionary, and so on. So the result of this economic tension is eventually going to be a political revolution. What he posited then was a theory of historical causality that ran from economic structure to political revolution. In other words, given the right economic conditions, a mature capitalist society, and the formation of industrial proletariat, political revolution was bound to follow. So the movement of the economic motor propelled political change. This is what we call a materialist vision of history. Material change, i.e. economic change, generates political change. A materialist theory of history. To express his certainty about this theory of change, Marx designed or designated his theory as scientific socialism, to distinguish it from what he called the utopian socialists, who didn't have their finger on what he called the scientific laws of history. So this, in a nutshell, was Marx's theory of history, as it explained the inevitable evolution from liberalism to socialism. Now, in practical terms, what this meant was that for Marx, the socialist revolution was most likely to happen in the most advanced capitalist countries in Europe. In Europe, of course, that meant England, and later Germany, perhaps in the late 19th century, or perhaps France. And when Marx was writing in the mid-19th century, this did seem the most possible or the most plausible outcome. These were the countries that were experiencing, in fact, the most radical organization among the working classes. They were the center of popular unrest. When he was writing the Communist Manifesto in 1848, there were popular revolutions across Europe. This was the great year of revolutions in Europe. In 1870, there was the Paris Commune, when it appeared that the working class rose up and tried to take over the city. That year also, the International Union of Socialist Parties had formed. So there was this feeling that Europe and the most advanced countries in Europe were the center of potential revolutionary activity. But of course, by 1914, that picture had changed. Revolution in Europe had been squashed in 1848, the Paris Commune had been squashed, and the new industrial proletariat actually had grown less revolutionary rather than more revolutionary over time. That is, from, say, 1870 to 1914. They began to form trade unions that were much more interested in gaining short-term benefits, higher wages, better working conditions, things like that. And they seem to be much less interested in the long-term goal of overthrowing the bourgeois state. Socialist labor unions claimed to be interested in the future revolution. They never gave that up as part of their list of goals, but most of their activity was directed towards immediate economic gains. What seems obvious to scholars now, that is, that revolutionary potential is actually stronger in the initial stages of the transition to capitalism, in that period of uncertainty when workers don't have a lot of benefits, than under a mature capitalist society. This was exactly the opposite of what Marx and the Marxists believed at the time. What Marx never saw was the potential of a mature capitalist society to co-opt workers, to woo them with consumer goods and the promise of the good life. Marx never saw that. He thought that workers were going to become more and more revolutionary over time, and in fact what's happened is that the more developed capitalist societies become, the more workers tend to become integrated into capitalism through their own benefits, through the consumer goods that they're able to purchase, and the good life that they're able to develop. But in 1914, this was not yet apparent. It was apparent only that waiting around for economic forces to push the proletariat into power didn't seem to be working. In other words, Marxism had reached a kind of impasse. The impasse was symbolized by the position of European socialist parties, which had become powerful movements but hadn't been able to seize power through electoral means. So you have this huge German Social Democratic Party, for example, but that is stabilized at getting around 30% of the vote and can't seem to move beyond that. So they're kind of at an impasse. How do they move beyond that huge voting population, which is still a minority, but they can't seize power? So European socialist movements didn't really have any other ideas other than to wait for the right economic movement. You know, if they're waiting for economic forces to come to a certain point where then political revolution is inevitable. But the problem is they'd been waiting around for 60 years and nothing had happened. The capitalist system was still there. So what happens then to break this impasse of Marxist thought and revitalize socialism in the post-war years? Of course, one of the most important developments is the emergence of this new communist movement, which claims to follow Marx but adapts him to 20th century realities. And as I said earlier, the central figure in this adaptation is Lenin. He, more than anyone else, grasped the failures of 19th century socialism and laid out a new plan. Lenin considered himself a Marxist, and he shared all of Marx's basic goals about the most just society. Lenin's enemies were Marxists, capitalism, the bourgeoisie, liberalism. He shared the vision of a future socialist society. But as a man of the 20th century, Lenin was much more skeptical about the assurance of progress, about the notion that if workers waited long enough, the revolution would happen. What he did then was to shift the emphasis in Marxist theory from inevitability to a revolution based on the force of will, from predestination to voluntarism, we might say. In other words, if the revolution was going to happen, workers would have to make it happen. This simple change in emphasis definitively broke with 19th century notions of automatic progress through reason and took up the 20th century cry of action. In this sense, Lenin was similar to Nietzsche, the futurists, and the Dadaists who called on people to throw themselves into the void and make history. So communism, in other words, is not only a political attack on liberalism, but it becomes part of this broader intellectual attack on the Enlightenment assumptions of progress and reason. If Marx was a scientist, Lenin was a man of action. Within Marxist theory, this seemingly simple change of emphasis opened a whole new set of theoretical possibilities. It made the theory more fluid, more open to situations that didn't exactly fit those described by Marx. In particular, of course, Lenin was concerned about his own country, Russia. From the 1905 revolution in Russia, he saw the revolutionary potential in his country, but he also saw that it didn't fit the standard Marxist model. Russia was, of course, the weakest of the industrial countries in Europe, not the strongest. And industrially, politically, it was not the most advanced. Liberal, bourgeois country as well. So Russia was a country just in the throes of a transition from a feudal to a capitalist economy, barely beginning to undergo a bourgeois revolution. Despite this backward economic state, Lenin thought the country was ready for revolution if measured by what he called the revolutionary spirit of the people. He realized, therefore, that the only hope for revolution in Russia was to push the political revolution first and then follow it by the economic revolution. In other words, to reverse Marx's priorities. Rather than wait for a capitalist revolution and then follow it with the political, to reverse that. So he stressed again, action first and economic transition later. And that's what I mean by voluntarism over predestination, or will over reason. As a result of this new strategy, other differences followed between Marx and Lenin's thought, which come to define 20th century communism versus 19th century socialism. First, since industrialization was weak and the proletariat was small, he had to take the peasantry seriously as political actors in the revolution. And Marx had never taken the peasants seriously because he thought in a mature communist society that the peasants would be absorbed into the working class. Second, Lenin's reliance on a vanguard leadership. Since the true proletariat was small, of course you had to rely on a vanguard leadership to realize where the future was going, to take that minority class and then turn it into the majority class of the future. As Lenin said in What Is to Be Done, the spontaneous struggle of the proletariat will not become a genuine class struggle until it is led by a strong organization of revolutionaries, unquote. This then is the shift in Marxist thought from the 19th to the 20th century. Because of these ideas, it brought a new excitement into the communist movement that was absent from the socialists by 1914. For Marx, the power in the excitement of socialism came from its scientific inevitability. And that's what made it such a 19th century idea. That's what gave him the excitement of where it was going, the surety of progress. But for Lenin and the communists, power came with action, the ability to change the world now. This excitement in and of itself, I think, was one reason that communism attracted people in this post-war era, in an era that glorified action over reason. But on the other hand, of course, communism retained the original appeal of socialism with its blueprint for integrating the masses into a society, for giving them a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a sense of power. It offered a new community, of course, for all of those uprooted individuals created by the process of modernization. All those people who no longer had their local communities, their local roots. So it offered to the challenge of mass society, and it delivered that solution in a language of action that fit what I've called this larger spirit of the age. Now, obviously, while the horrors of actual communist regimes disappointed these initial hopes, what some would argue was that the initial problem of this gap between the individual and the community has not necessarily been bridged even today, in that many people around the world are more willing to die for a community, whether it's a racial community, an ethnic or religious, a national community, than for the individual. So the question really is whether the lack of community is a fundamental weakness, a fundamental and permanent weakness of liberal democracy, or whether it's not the community but individual self-interest that provides the basis for a stable society. And I think this has become a specific issue, for example, in Europe now, in the formation of greater ties within the European Union, has raised this whole debate about, well, what brings us together? There's all sorts of administrative ties then between the European countries, but not necessarily a sense of a common project. So the debate today is whether they need such a sense of some sort of common project to hold them together. In the U.S., some communitarian scholars have argued that America has never had a language of community outside of religious discourse. And so it's hard for Americans to articulate a common project. although I think it's important that September 11th provided at least briefly an articulation of a common. So we're left, I think, with a set of questions about liberal democracy, individualism, and the community, which have easy or clear answers.